Yeah, we can see your screen.
Okay, so CRTs. So with the person import, you should have, and that's the integration that actually has most of the CRTs. There's quite a few different fields that the person import integration interacts with and adds data to. So a lot of those are kind of grouped together based on what functionality those profiles affect and put into the different CRTs that the person import utilizes to do any sort of mapping or translation. From the integration menu, you can come in here and go to reference tables to either upload or download a CRT. So the process is to first come in here, download the CRT. You can open it in Excel, you can open it in Notepad, whatever editing software you want to use. But I will say one thing is if you do open it in Excel, if there's any fields in that CRT in that table that have leading zeros, Excel's probably going to do that. You know, the classic Excel issue of it wipes those out on numeric fields. So saving it as an Excel.csv file might remove those leading zeros. So just be kind of cognizant of that fact. And if we need to, I don't think you guys have any leading zeros anywhere in the CRTs for the person import, but just keep that in mind because I know it's caused problems before. Obviously, those problems kind of are fairly apparent because usually those will trigger errors in the person import because there's not the integration can't make a match with the table and doesn't do the translation, and then the profile doesn't get updated accordingly. So, but that's really probably the biggest complication with this is if you do open and save in Excel, keep an eye out for any fields with leading zeros in them. But normally it is pretty straightforward. You can come in here and click download and then navigate to the person import itself. You click on it, it'll be highlighted, and then you can select and go in here and pull any of the CRTs down. And they're all kind of named after what they functionally handle and which fields they touch. You know, accruals, attendance, leave, CRT, assigning accrual profiles, attendance profiles, the relevant admins for attendance and leave if need be. The rest of these that are listed here are the ones that don't kind of follow this format because they are just custom. In the case of needing additional CRT logic, we have 5 spaces that we kind of keep just in case, 5 additional tables in case we need to use those and set up any sort of translation for a field outside of what all of the rest of these tables touch. So there's one for employment terms by itself. There's a table for payrolls by itself. Those are the only 2, I believe, that are just one profile assignment, really. Those 2 tables just handle the payroll and the employment term assignment if needed. The remainder pretty much cover you know, a myriad of different profiles. So, but I think the names kind of adequately convey that in this case. So like employee role assignments, this is handling kind of a whole slew of those different profiles and fields that are going to handle access and visibility in the system for employees, people who have an employee role. And likewise, there's also one for managers as well. So you can see if we pull one of these down, if I download this employee role table, it gives you the download link, and I'm just going to open it in Excel. Here's the CRT that might be familiar with from earlier talks that was kind of scoped out. We have our lookup keys over on the left. The integration takes a combination of these fields if they're defined. So since we've got roll number, country, worker type, part type, pay type, and employment term, it's going to take a composite of all 5 of those fields from the source fields in the employee file and try and combine them to find a match with any one of these rows. And then obviously there are some wildcards here, just meaning anything in these fields. So there's a person in the source file that's got a 1 for their roll number, they're a U.S. employee, and they're part-time. It'll catch here first because that's coming through, and these kind of don't matter because they're wildcarded. And as long as there's a match here on this row, it'll come through and assign each of the profiles based on what's on that row. So your pay code edit, what pay codes the employee has access to, what their worker type is, which device group they need, attestation profile for testing, and then as well as a few others. Paper value profile, I think it's the other one actually. But that's kind of, I mean, that's the structure of each of the tables. I believe you're all familiar with that. But as far as like downloading, you can download and open them in Excel, like I said, or any other text editor and make adjustments. If there's a profile that you need to change the name of, you can do that. You can add whatever you want in there. Obviously, just keeping in mind if you make a change, you want to make sure that that specific profile is valid and created in the system ahead of adding it to the CRT, because if that's not a valid profile that gets added, if it's not a valid pay code edit profile in this case, there's going to be employees that probably match on that row and that will try and be assigned to this profile, and if it's not valid, you'll get errors in the transaction system after you've uploaded your changes to this particular table. Does that kind of make sense as far as downloads go? Making changes to the CRTs here in Excel. Any questions on that specifically? And are there any other tables you guys want to look at?
Sharath and Jyotish, I'm leaning more on you. So okay, yeah.
Okay. After you make those changes and save that, you'll just save the document to your own computer. One thing you'll want to keep in mind is that there's 2 restrictions for uploading a CRT. You need to, it's the same process. You come back in here and you go to the person import, click select, except now you're going to have a browse button at the top. You can browse your documents and find the CRT that you saved to your computer. The only keys are you'll need to make sure that that document is still a .csv file, and it needs to be less than 1 megabyte of data, which I don't think that'll necessarily be a problem in most cases. The key is going to be the .csv, that you keep that format the same. Be careful not to save it as like an Excel file or something similar like a TXT. We want it to be comma delimited. Reason being, the integration is looking for commas when it's parsing and processing the data in those CRTs. So they do have titles, each of the CRTs as you download them, but technically those aren't important when you're saving a document and re-uploading it. It's just that it is a CSV. When you come to upload a CRT, you'll select which CRT you want to take your CSV and overwrite. So in this case, I pulled down the imp role. I would go, after I saved that change I made, I didn't make a change in this case, but for the sake of example, after I save the changes, I can come browse, select the document that I saved, the .csv, and then come in here and select imp role. And then once I click upload, it'll overwrite what's out there and deployed for that CRT in particular. So, Cheryl, I'm not sure if you were clear on this before, but I just want to make sure. I know Jyotish, you asked specifically for this. Does that kind of make sense? Do you have any questions on the process? That's pretty much it as far as downloading, making changes, re-uploading anything for the CRT.
Brian, now it's clear.
Okay. Yep, and I mean, just to go just a step further, so like if you're ever looking at an error in the person import, it's not always necessarily going to require a change to a CRT, but I know we have a couple lingering errors in the latest employee run too that are more related to the source data, I think, in a lot of cases. I know we have those masks on some of the name fields, so we're getting a couple errors that are based on the last name field in workforce dimensions. It has a 30-character limit, and some of these masked names, I think it's got a couple people's names here from the source data, are just failing out because of that. So not really a CRT thing. That field is just being directly mapped from the source data to what workforce dimensions needs. So there's no translation happening. In those cases, either you can resubmit the error in here, or if that's something that needs to be provided to Fusion to make an adjustment, we can do that. But I know Shared and I think already talked through these errors, and that's just something, since we're in UAT, we'll just live with these for now, but moving to the prod system in Fusion should resolve that. We won't have a problem with the names anymore, so these should go away. But But from time to time, if there's like a new pay rule or something that you need to get created in the system here, and let's say there's a typo added to one of the CRTs, and that pay rule name you added into that doesn't line up with what the configured profile looks like, you might get an error that pops up in here and says pay rule not valid. At which point you could come into the error and click on it, find the again, this is basically the readout of the API request that is made to do an update. Pay rule is actually going to be under the job assignment tab here, but in this example, so if there was like a typo with the pay rule, you could come in and actually directly make the change here to the individual error, and similar to kind of in Workforce Central, and then resubmit. But in order for that, to not keep showing up every time the interface runs, that's where you'd need to make sure, go back in and check the CRT for pay rules in this case, and ensure that the right profile name is defined there and that there's not any problems. That way subsequent interface runs won't have the same issue. Okay, so that's pretty much CRTs. I did mention here some of these errors are with the source data. So what we're going to look at here, and what I wanted to cover today, was going to be the main subprocess in Dellboomi for the person import that does all of the direct mapping from source file. But the keys are going to be that you can, if you're familiar with where this is located, you can navigate to it, and you can see each field and what's being done to that field. Just in case you ever need to review that, in case there's some confusion on how something is getting updated. I think that's where we want to leave it, at least as far as what I can go over with you all and prepare you for in case you need to review any of that side of things on the back end. But again, I do want to kind of avoid actually making changes to this, just because it kind of opens us up to the person if we're having issues if we do that. So I'm not actually positive about this. This might be something we need to circle back and get you guys access for, but you can get to Dellboomi from the setup menu in Workforce Dimensions. I don't know if Sherrod or Jatish, you've tried to do this before or not. You haven't? Or you do have it? Okay, great. So yeah, but you would just come into Design Integration Templates to get there. I'm not sure if your access differs than mine. Through my Services Level 3 account, there's actually quite a bit of a delay to get Dellboomi to open up. It could be a minute or two, so I don't know if you have a similar problem or if you've seen that, but just be patient with it. It'll load after a minute or two in most cases, and it kind of fluctuates a little bit as far as how long it takes. But once you do get in here, for the most part, I think you'll be looking at the employee data import here. On prod, this will be a little bit more clean. I think we have some other integrations and things that are in here in UAT. They're not deployed, but the interface files themselves still exist out here. But in this case, it's the employee data import we want to look at. So I'm going to open that subfolder up, and then we're going to look at the processes. For now, again, I'm not really going to go too in-depth over most of this stuff here. And I know this says cross-reference tables. I do kind of want to avoid talking about this, I think, because there's actually two separate places where the cross-reference tables reside. There's the direct tables that are here in Dellboomi, and then there's the deployed version. The deployed versions are going to be any changes that have happened from anybody on the front end who has downloaded and made adjustments to a CRT and then re-uploaded. So eventually, after this is deployed and running on a prod environment, the copies of these tables, if you open these and look at them, those are probably going to be outdated, because when you upload a new CRT, those are actually a different instance than the actual tables that exist here on the back end. There's just a separate deployment process for when you're doing that through the front end. So this is more, these tables exist here just for visibility and when doing UAT testing and things for most of our implementations. I'll come in and take a look at these, but as far as if you're going to look at something with a CRT, I would advise don't look here, just pull a copy down from the front end. That way you can see what the integration is working with. But the main thing you can get in and take a look at is we're going to go to processes, and then it is the source mapping subprocess down here. The base process is right here, people import. I'm actually going to go step through and just show you where source mapping is referenced. So there's a lot of stuff here, but ultimately it comes all the way to the end. It goes and it gets the file from the server and it processes that, depending on which SFTP site the integration needs to connect to. It goes to the next subprocess at the end here, where it's going to initiate the records being processed from the source file. And it's going to step through, and it's ultimately going to get right here to this subprocess, which this is where the source file is generated. That data is kind of flowing through the different Dellboomi shapes here. There's some data processing that's happening that's kind of splitting up records for more easy access to make adjustments and things. But once we get into the source mapping step, this is where most of the kind of logic resides on how those fields, how the data is being massaged to fit our API request and ultimately update the data in the workforce dimension. So it's this first map here that the logic kind of resides in. There's some additional things. I think we kind of shortly touched on this on a previous call, but I'll just mention it again. This kind of exists in case there's any additional logic we need to add. So I did a custom function, if you remember, Sharat and Jyotish, for our U.S. and Philippines managers. We don't want them to have a timekeeping entitlement. We just want them to have the manager role. So in order to accommodate that, I had to add some logic to check and see if the person being processed is somebody in the U.S. or Philippines and is a manager. Because if they are, I need to not send over a couple of these profiles because they're specific to somebody with a timekeeping entitlement. Somebody who doesn't have that is not going to have an employment status. They're not going to have an employment status effective date, and they're not going to have an employment term assigned. So in that case, if it's one of those people who's a manager in the U.S. or Philippines and they're only getting a manager role, this data is set up to only send blanks so that those profiles don't get updated and you don't get any errors when the interface processes. Otherwise, that info still flows through for all the other employees at India who do have employment statuses and who need those to be considered as active. But this one, I don't expect you to necessarily need to come in here. Other than that, everything else is just really a straight pass-through. So if this makes sense, this map kind of exists in case you wanted to change anything for any of these fields in the API request itself. But really, all of that's being set in the map before this. And as you can see, this is pretty much just a direct pass of every field through. So it's from one profile to the next. It's really kind of the same profile between the two, outside of this one function that I've created that changes just these fields. But I'm going to close out of here because I do want to spend most time on this map here. Before I jump in here real quick, so there is one disqualification I've added. So this is called a decision shape. Basically, you can provide the source data that's flowing through here. I'm grabbing a specific field from that. In this case, it's a field that's set up to be used for qualification. In that qualifier, I've set up some logic to look at the country that an employee record belongs to, because we only want to bring in India employees or U.S. and Philippines managers. So I've made that like a binary piece of logic. So if it's true and we want to send that employee record through, it's either an employee who is their country is India, or their timekeeping entitlement is false and their manager role is true, right? Because if that's true, the only other people who fit that kind of schema are those U.S. and Philippines managers who we also want to come through. So that's what this little shape is handling, is it takes what's happening in this first map and with that qualifying logic. And if it's an employee that we don't want processing, it's going to come up here to this shape and it's going to stop just that specific record. All the other employee records are still going to flow through and go through the rest of the integration process, and their information is going to be added to workforce dimensions or updated if they're already existing there. Does that kind of make sense, at least as far as the qualifier is considered and how that works? We'll kind of see the logic when I go in here, but at least conceptually for now. Okay, well, I will go in and take a look at the map now. So I know there's a lot here. What I kind of want to do, we got about 30 minutes left. I do want to conceptually share with you each portion, what it is, the left, the right, the middle functions, And then that way you'll kind of be armed with how those work, and you can kind of follow the path for each field from our source data. On the left here, this is the person import file format, right? Each one of these fields is one of the fields, and they are in order for the data that we're sending in the employee file, starting with person number, there's a manager license field, their name information, all of their demographic info, and then a couple things with like the business structure or labor category and some of your custom data fields in here. So, for example, well, before I say that actually, middle section is functions. So any logic that to do any translations or handle any specific scenarios to kind of manipulate the data as it exists in the source file before sending it to the API request body over here. That's in here. And there's lots of different functions and things that Dellboomi has existing custom functions and string manipulations and the like that allow you to do those data manipulations before you ultimately send your data to the API request over on the right. And the API request is pretty dense for our person record update. I mean, if you go in here and you look at a people record, this is somebody I was looking at who's just a manager that we've added. So there's actually less in here. But if we grab any employee, I think this was share it here. Well, I can grab any of these actually, I believe. Let's just do this. There's obviously a lot of fields, right? I mean, we've got maybe 15 to 20 tabs of multiple fields that have information that can be stored. So the request to get all of that info in here is fairly large, and there's some effective dating tied to some of the fields as well. So we'll have to be aware of those in those cases. For things like the employment status, the user account, the payroll, the primary business structure, all that info is passed in here and attached to certain locations on the request body. So in this case, it's kind of used as an ID, but the employee ID of the person being processed in question needs to go to two separate places in the request body. There's one under an identity tag here, and there's one under user info a little bit farther down. Right here. So I don't suspect any of that ever needing changed. I think most of the things you guys will be looking at if you do come in here at any point will be checking and making sure the right lookup keys are passed to the right function in the middle here, because this section here is basically where all the CRTs are set up, and you can see here, like here's the license CRT. It's got all the lookup keys on the left here. These are the inputs, and you're basically picking each field from the source file that needs to go into each corresponding lookup key, right? So if you're looking at a CRT that we pulled down, let me see if I've actually got the license CRT up over here. You can see in the table itself, it shows, right, this first lookup key is the country, field 17 from the source file, and the second key is the roll number, field 56. So then if we come back into the Dellboomi process, you can see we've got two links here. We've got the country in the source file going right to lookup key 1 to cleanly match up with what's written in the CRT. And if we scroll down and find field 56, roll number, that's going into lookup key 2. This is kind of a complex example because it does have a couple extra fields that are happening. And that's just because this table in particular actually not only is used to handle the entitlement assignments, but it's also accomplishing the user access. So like giving a username and a password and a user account status to an employee who needs it. So there were a couple things we needed to bring in to accomplish that, like there's a user account name field from the source data that we wanted to map directly. And there's also the employee ID that we grabbed and brought into this function in particular. Maybe a better example is a different table, like the employment term table. This one's pretty straightforward. Again, it's just got the lookup keys being brought from the source data. So in this case, we're looking at country. Scroll back down. Roll number. Oh, sorry, I'm looking at the wrong one. we are talking country, we're talking the FTE percentage is the second key, third key, did I get that right? Sorry, employment term is the second key, FTE percentage is the third key, the pay type is the fourth key. And then you can click edit on this. Actually, it shows the inputs, it shows the output, but that's obviously kind of visible here from the box. So the employment term is then taken from the outputs and mapped to the API request where the employment term needs to go. So in this case, it's right here. Yes, I did. So those are actually going to custom fields. So if we scroll, and this is I hope I'm not overloading you with info here, but these are cached data that I actually added to this source profile. Because remember, if we need to get the grade and pass that into those custom fields, we basically need to, we're taking the grade of the supervisor of each employee that's being processed. So I had to take all of the IDs in the employee file and store that info away along with their grade. And then basically I'm matching, as an employee record comes through here, that employee has a reports to for L1 and L2, right? So based on the ID that's showing in that reports to field, this cached data here is basically referencing all of the employees and what their individual grades are, and doing a lookup based on what's in reports to and what's in the L2 manager fields for this employee being processed. So it basically it looks up that info and gets the grade for those two supervisors for an employee, and then it directly maps each of those to the custom data fields for manager ID level 1 and manager ID level 2. So that's probably the most complex thing in here, just having the cached data, because there's actually a separate process in the integration overall where the cache is actually set up so that the data from the source file feeds into that cache, it's stored, and then it's referenceable later in the overall integration process to be picked up and kind of, yeah, you're right. I mean, because we're caching data and then referencing it later. There are some complex maps still in here. There's some custom. I mean, like the license table we looked at earlier. It's actually a function. It's not just a CRT in this case. So there's a lot of stuff to look at here. I know this can be kind of overwhelming when looking at it, but this is just handling the different scenarios for each entitlement, right? Whether it's just timekeeping or it's an employee role or a manager role. Because, for example, if an employee needs an employee or a manager role, they also are going to need all of their user account information. So that's kind of what this scripting is doing here. Is it's taking in that info. If they are an active employee or an active manager, we need to also get the account name and the password and send that information so that the person in question, who is an employee or manager, can see, can log in and access the system on a computer. But this is kind of what like a custom function looks like in here, because again, there's more lines going from inputs to outputs and going to different Boomi functions. In this case, there's a lot of scripting, but it can be a little overwhelming. I think this is probably the most complex one. Yeah. Which So they won't error out, right? Because if they are a manager, they're getting added to the system with just a manager role. They don't, like the employee specific profiles, like a pay rule or a time entry method, the timekeeping license itself, that information is being disqualified and not sent. specifically because we're only giving them that manager role in the record, which, that doesn't take up any entitlements. It does give them an employee record to log in, and they can, use the system as a manager would, basically defined on how their access profiles kind of limit their access to the system. But they won't error out. They actually do get imported as manager role employee records only. If that makes sense. For those, yep, for anybody who's a manager. It's through the ancillaries actually. So nothing in here actually creates those employee groups, but it actually gets assigned through the person report here, which is just taking an existing employee group and then assigning. So that is through the CRT though. That's the manager specific one. We scroll through here, we can find it right here. So you can see here, manager employee group. It's taking the keys for that specific lookup table, and then it's sending this back here. So I'm trying to think if there's a more complex function in here to look at, but honestly, I think that license one is probably the most complicated. All the others, for the most part, are just CRT references, and you can kind of tell based on the header of the function itself. It'll just say cross-reference lookup if it's just a cross-reference table. If it's actually a function in the middle, it'll either have a custom name or something similar. So like you can see when I go back up to the license, this is called license assignment function. But when you create a function, you can set a name to it basically. So it could be any name. But all of the CRTs are kind of referenced here. Status, the profile CRT, the imp role and the manager role assignments, the pay rule CRT, the accrual CRT. Fortunately, Boomi doesn't let you rename what these functions show up as. They just say cross-reference lookup. But usually you can kind of tell just by looking at the outputs, right? So this is the employment term CRT. This is the profile CRT, because you can see we have our function access and display profiles. Almost everything in here ends with the word profile that we're giving access to. Here's our accruals, attendance and leave. We've got the accrual profile, the attendance profile, leave profile, and admin. I'll note something real quickly here. So this is a templated integration. So by default, regardless of if we're actually assigning every profile from the CRT, I know some of the CRTs we've left some fields blank. The map will still show these connected, but that's not a problem. All that's doing, it'll still pass through data technically, but if it's blank, it's going to send nothing. It's going to send a blank value, and then that's going to get dropped from the API request, and obviously that profile in particular wouldn't be updated in that case. But yeah, for the most part, that's what is existing here in the functions. But one other thing I will mention, so there's also scripting that these integrations use, and those are we use, it's called Groovy script. It's kind of similar to JavaScript, but that's the language that any of our scripting is coded in here in Dellboomi. You can, on any of these functions, you can come in and click edit, and you can then see the contents of whatever you're looking at. In the case of a function or a CRT, you might get like a window like this, but this is just a script by itself, taking some inputs, sending an output, and there's scripting logic in here. It's just a pretty straightforward if-else statement for what to do in a certain situation with these effective dates. Not in this case, no. We can't write any direct SQL queries to. Yeah, it's just Groovy. But I don't necessarily think, just knowing what the interface does, I don't think you'll necessarily need to be changing any scripting in here. I think it's mostly just going to be, I think the benefit here is if you're confused about something that doesn't look quite right in the system, and maybe it looks like it's right in the CRT, but it doesn't appear to be updating like you expect, you can come in here, look for that specific field, and then basically trace it, right? Just go through the process. Like, okay, well, let's say, what's a good example here? I'll just grab a random profile from the info role. Let's say like the employee worker type isn't being populated, or even though you've got something set in the employee role CRT, you can come in here and just, what I would do is just make sure each of the keys that you see connected here match what the Emperor CRT states they should be, which that's in that header record of each of the cross-reference tables if you download them from the application. That looks good. Check the outputs. Make sure the worker type is represented there in this case, and then follow its output and see where that gets placed in the request body. If there's any sort of problem, like it's not mapped or something similar, either I can help with that, or that's a KGS case in that instance, if we do find a problem like that. But in this case, I mean, this is mapped, so there wouldn't be a problem in that instance. That kind of makes sense. That's kind of what I'm trying to arm you guys with here, just at a high level. I already feel like I'm kind of overwhelming you all with how much is on the screen here, but let me know if you have any questions about anything in particular. I know there's a lot to kind of cover, but try and keep it simple with what we can use this knowledge for to better understand how the interface is assigning each individual thing. I know there's a lot of fields here, and you're not as, obviously I'm more familiar with the Kronos API request body for the person data as a whole, but I think it works best to just, if there's a problem with a profile, find out how it's being assigned based on the source data, and then just follow the lines essentially to see where it's being placed in the request body over here. And usually it's pretty easy to tell if it's in the right place or the wrong place, because, like, for example, with the worker type, you scroll and find where it's being placed, you see that the actual tag is just called worker type name, so that seems like it'd be the right place for that to go. Let me see. What else is there that I can mention? I think that's most of it. Yeah, I didn't state this, but I think I was going to. But after most of those data translations and things happen, these maps later on in the process are to handle doing different things for different scenarios. I think they're kind of titled in that way. So it'll branch out and send the same data to all three of these different paths before ultimately merging them again and sending them to the end of the process here. But this is a map. Yep. So for like a new hire, yeah, the main thing for new hires is if there is something custom that a client would need, we can use this map to handle that. If there's like a new hire where we want to do something specific for new hires only. But by default, if there's not anything custom, the main thing that changes here is that the hire date is actually set. So we actually pass the hire date through here in this map. These other two, for updating existing employee records, we don't pass the hire date. Reason being, the hire date in our system is actually an original hire date. It functions as that. So we don't ever want to touch this field again after it's initially set, because adjusting this actually affects the time cards and totalization in the system for that employee. Adjusting it opens up the time card or closes it off depending on what date you're setting that to. So as of 5/15/2017, this employee record will have a time card and be, there's obviously, if it's not signed off, edits can be made and time can be punched to there. But let's say that happens on 5/15/2017 and then there's actual punch time and then this hire date field is updated to a later date. That could cause some issues because that data is then going to get lost because the time cards get removed and totalization occurs again. So we don't ever really want to change that field again. Only for hire date, correct. just because of how it functions. Correct. Yep. And what I've done with those based on what you emailed me was I've just set those to the employment status effective date. Let's show that here. So again, the data flows through this map first, and then it just continues on and goes through each of these branches, right? But so I'm basically coming in here and setting these and saying, okay, for the effective dates, we want to use this data. So let me look. Let's find a payroll here. Oh, this is good to mention too. You can search here. I don't know how beneficial that would be if you guys don't necessarily know always what you're looking for, but it will kind of give you, if you get the spelling the same as what the tag is called, it'll search and find it. One thing I like to do is if I'm looking for payroll in this case, I'll search for payroll and get any of the fields, and then I'll just find a line that's dark and find where it lines up here. And then if you come out and delete that, you can then scroll through and basically find it to where that date is actually going in and being assigned. In this case, I found one where it's going to multiple places, but here's where I was looking at. So now I can see all of the fields that relate to the payroll, which is in this case it's just the date and the payroll name itself. But this is what I wanted to show. So now I've taken what's here in the employment status effective date and I've mapped it to those various fields, payroll being one of them. So anytime somebody comes through on the person board process, it's going to look at that employment status effective date to use as the update for payroll, as well as employment term and accrual profile. Before I had it set to the higher date. In this case, I don't think we need to, because we're just doing a direct pass, but sorry, continue, please. I thought we wanted to keep that manual though, so you would be aware of it. Remember, because if it does come through, I kind of agree with you, because that would help, and then you could obviously get the profile assigned. But in the case of that scenario where if we have somebody who's getting updated in the middle of the pay period, I think we probably want that error to throw, so you'll be aware of it in case any manual adjustments need to be made as far as like what's on their time card. Yeah, so like, yeah, I'm just thinking in terms of, so like, for example, if the payroll switched in the middle of the pay period and I had that logic in here, because if it's back in a signed off time period, if it's an update that needed to happen back at that point, if I added that logic in here to look at the sign off date, and if it's beyond the sign off date, use the sign off date as the effective date, so that somebody will then have their payroll updated as of the sign off date, which might not be accurate, right? If they actually needed to have their payroll effective as of an earlier date, that could impact any punched or edited time on their time card within that small window. At which point, I think what we discussed was somebody on your end would need to be manually changing the time card to correctly pay out those scenarios. Oh, okay. Gotcha. Okay. All right. Well, then I'll add that logic in there. Yep. Okay. Sorry about that. Yeah, and then you're right. And in this case, yeah, I would basically take these maps I've made and I'd port them here to a function where I could check and make sure that that date doesn't line up with the employee's sign-off date. So I can put that in there, but that's going to actually require a little bit of extra work, because I'll need to have some cached data reference to be able to get that info of when an employee's sign-off date is actually applied. Okay, but Oh yeah. Yeah, sure. Yeah, so you've got the actual kind of one of the paths that rolls down in here. Did you have something specific you wanted? Yeah, there were still a couple errors. Looks like just the one, so 1314304. Sorry, I'm trying to find it here. Here it is. So yeah, and that's kind of the tricky thing. Yeah, what we'd need to do in this case is indate it actually. Deleting is kind of not particularly easy to do with the business structure here, just because if there's other references that have already been attached to an existing cost code, it kind of creates a ripple effect through the system. So usually we don't delete, but if you need to get rid of it, we can indate it as of after when it was effective dated. Because in this case, we probably want to set this. Well, was this a new cost code that was just recently added that this is like an accurate date, or was this just when you added it? I'm guessing it was just when you added it. Okay, because what we want to try and do is just leave this open-ended and set it to the beginning of time for any new things we add. Well, let me see if I can actually do anything with this date. I don't know if this has been assigned to anybody yet. Expiration date should be moving into today's date. What? It is. See if I can rename this at all. Okay, let me reach out to Michael and confirm on this, but I know we've had other situations where this has been a problem and we know ways around it. I just, off the top of my head, I'm not realizing what that is. But usually it involves indating the old code and then adding a different one. But there might be something we need to do to the name to allow for that, because you're right. It's going to be unique. So since this is already created, but I'm guessing the error kind of makes sense. This business structure is being effective dated for their hire date. So yep. Okay. You have another question? Yeah, and I've been doing some work on the L1L2 employee group process as well. So I was kind of manually making adjustments and things the past couple of days. I think because the file's not there, I'll have to check. I actually did that a little bit earlier this morning, so I thought I saw the file out there in FileZilla, but I need to check on the internal to make sure, because what could have happened was that file was run previously, and then it got dropped. The interface removes it after it processes it, so okay, that must be what it is. Yeah. Well, you can look at. I mean, there's a file that goes out there, I believe, every day. The only thing was I don't think there's anything later than the 24th, which that's interesting because this has been coming regularly. So I don't know if we need to check with the process that's sending these. That's probably just why I picked this one because I was checking to see what the latest date was, and that was the one. So, but a good. I mean, obviously I'm trying to think. What the process would need to be is that it removes the file, but maybe I need to stop doing that for the time being, just so you can just run at any point with whatever file you want. Because right now we can go on the date that you actually apply when you run this integration. But if this is scheduled to run each night, you'd have to send another file if the interface is deleting that file previously. Gotcha. Gotcha. And do you have a manual process to push things to the SFTP, separate from like the automated fusion process? Okay, does that work with getting like, will you still be able to get files that have your scenarios that you want to cover? Or is that only possible from coming directly from Fusion? Okay. Okay. Well, then you know what? I don't think I need to make any changes. If you're doing a manual change in a file like that, just send it to SFTP. Keep track. You can give it any name you want. Keep track of what you name it, and then when you run the interface manually, you can actually just put that in there, and it'll grab whatever file you specify here. It's just that it'll need to change a little bit for the automated runs because I'm going to basically be using not a hard-coded date in this case, but it's going to append the today's date to the end of the file name that it's looking for to pick up the latest, essentially. Yes, it should be from the run summary. Similar to this, if I come in here and look at the parameters, it tells you what file name it grabs. It'll show you that still. Okay. Well, I'm running around time here. I'm going to have to drop, but thanks for your time again today here, everyone. We kind of covered a lot, but feel free to just reach out over email or anything if you have any questions about anything that you're looking at, whether in the Dellboomi process or here on the front end. I can look into it. But, again, thank you. Have a good evening and weekend, and I'm sure we'll be in touch again next week.
Thanks, Brad.
Thank you.